In the English department, we thought it might be nice to create some little webinars to help you with your remote learning for A Christmas Carol. So here's a little webinar to help you with task 6 and task 7 as you begin to read the story. Now, task 6 is all about the opening of the story. And as you may have already noticed, Dickens's opening to this little novella is really quite odd. So we're going to read it right now, and we're going to look think about why he decides to open his story in this particular way. Marley was dead to begin with. There is no doubt whatever about that. The register of his burial was signed by the clergyman, the clerk, the undertaker, and the chief mourner. Scrooge signed it, and Scrooge's name was good upon change for anything he chose to put his hand to. Old Marley was as dead as a doornail. Mind, I don't mean to say that I know of my own knowledge what there is particularly dead about a doornail. I've been inclined myself to regard a coffin nail as the deadest piece of ironmongery in the trade. But the wisdom of our ancestors is in the simile, and my unhallowed hands shall not disturb it, or the country's done for. You will therefore permit me to repeat emphatically that Marley was as dead as a doornail. Scrooge knew he was dead? Of course he did. How could it be otherwise? Scrooge and he were partners for I don't know how many years. Scrooge was his sole executor, his sole administrator, his sole assign, his sole residuary legatee, his sole friend and sole mourner. And even Scrooge was not so dreadfully cut up by the sad event, but that he was an excellent man of business on the very day of the funeral, and solemnized it with an undoubted bargain. So what do we learn from reading that opening to the story? It seems that Dickens really wants to emphasize a key point. And he wants to emphasize it so much that he actually repeats it 7 times. Marley is dead. Why would anybody need to repeat that point so many times for their reader? Well, perhaps he's just trying to be funny. Perhaps he's just trying to create a little bit of humour in his story as he opens up this little Christmas novella. Perhaps he wants to create a nice chatty tone with his reader. He certainly seems to want to create a relationship with them in the way that he talks to them almost as if he's talking author to you. It's obviously really important that the reader is aware that Marley is dead. This is obviously going to be important to the plot and something that, whether Dickens is being funny or not, he wants us to take in really, really strongly. And I would suggest it's a very important fact if we take into the view that the Victorian audience will be quite aware that this is a ghost story. So perhaps there's a little bit of foreshadowing going on here. Remember, your Victorians loved a good ghost story at Christmas. It was one of their great traditions, and they would be very pleased to know that Dickens is giving them exactly what they enjoy. So there you can see that in your own copy of the text, you could easily find all of the 7 examples of where Marley is described as dead. And I think that Dickens is trying to be a bit funny. He's trying to create an interesting opening to his story with a bit of a light tone, because whilst his story is going to be very moralistic, he does want you to inject a little bit of humour into that perhaps as well. Then we go on to the most important part very swiftly, where we meet his main character, Scrooge, and it's on the same page. You'll see this in your books as well. This is where we meet our main character. And once again, Dickens seems to want to make a very, very strong impression and to leave us in no doubt at all about what we should be thinking of this main character. Dickens is the king of characterization. If there's any reason why he's still famous today, and if there's any reason why his stories are so easily turned into film and televised, and his characters remain well loved and well known, it's because he really knew how to paint a picture, and he certainly didn't mind exaggerating his characters beyond all sort of sense, so that you could get a very, very pictorial almost impression of them. Physical descriptions seem to be as important to him, as well as engaging you with a very strong sense of their personality. So let's read this extract and think about what we gain from, what understanding we gain of Scrooge just from this opening description. Oh, but he was a tight-fisted hand at the grindstone, Scrooge. A squeezing, wrenching, grasping, scraping, clutching, covetous old sinner, hard and sharp as flint, from which no steel had ever struck out generous fire, secret and self-contained, and solitary as an oyster. The cold within him froze his old features, nipped his pointed nose, shrivelled his cheeks, stiffened his gait, made his eyes red, his thin lips blue, and spoke out shrewdly in his grating voice. A frosty rime was on his head and on his eyebrows and his wiry chin. He carried his own low temperature always about with him. He iced his office in the dog days and didn't thaw it out 1 degree at Christmas. Now, from that paragraph, you could easily highlight some of the key quotations that you think create a strong impression for you. For me, I'm immediately drawn to this really long list that exaggerates just how mean Scrooge is as a character in a very physical way. We have a list of adjectives that are really being, verbs being turned into adjectives there, because he's squeezing and wrenching and grasping and scraping and clutching as if he's physically taking everything that he can grab from everyone around him. Immediately you get a sense of a very greedy and unpleasant and harsh character. The sounds themselves of those words just make him sound cruel and hard. And that's really drawn together with the covetous old sinner. Within 2 lines, we know that this character is cruel, he's greedy, he's harsh, and he's a sinner. And in a moral tale set in Victorian London with an extremely important Christian context, being an old sinner is something that he is going to have to address along the way. He's hard and sharp as flint. He doesn't ever create generous fire or warmth. And then we have this sense that he's just solitary as an oyster, that he's so contained. If you think about an oyster and the way it sits in its shell and it clamps down, everything good about him is hidden away within this very, very hard shell that's tight and difficult to crack. My favourite bit is probably this last little section where we see him physically actually described as cold. The cold on him seems to just stick to him in this really exaggerated and humorous description of a pointed nose, a shriveled cheek, and actually frost on his eyebrows and his head and his chin. He's so cold that he actually takes a sort of physical frost with him. So we have a very, very exaggerated sense of a cold-hearted man. Then, of course, it goes on a little bit more in the next paragraph, but it continues with the same sort of theme of coldness. External heat and cold had little influence on Scrooge. No warmth could warm, no wintry weather chill him. No wind that blew was bitterer than he. No falling snow was more intent upon its purpose. No pelting rain less open to entreaty. Foul weather didn't know where to have him. The heaviest rain and snow and hail and sleet could boast of the advantage over him in only one respect. They often came down handsomely, and Scrooge never did. He's actually worse than the worst weather anyone could imagine. The hail, the snow, the rain, any sort of weather you'd never want to go out in. It's actually more generous than Scrooge because it actually rains hard or snows hard and you get lots of it, whereas Scrooge never gives anything. And then we learn that nobody ever stopped him in the street to say with gladsome looks, "My dear Scrooge, how are you? When will you come to see me?" No beggars implored him to bestow a trifle. No children asked him what it was o'clock. No man or woman ever once in all his life inquired the way to such and such a place of Scrooge. Even the blind men's dogs appeared to know him, and when they saw him coming on, would would wag their tails as though they said, "No eye at all is better than an evil eye, dark master." So going back to the idea that he's as solitary as an oyster, he actually repels everyone around him, beggars and children and people who might need a little bit of help. Even blind men's dogs seem to know that he's not someone to approach and will take their masters in a different way. And this idea that he actually has the evil eye relates him quite directly to a sort of devilish character, going back to the fact that he's a sinner. Tricky vocabulary in that. There is it's a Victorian text, so there's always going to be some words we perhaps don't use so often. And so we'll just have a little look at that, and you can look up any other words that you think you might need to. But covetous is a word that I thought some of you might not know. It just means to envy what other people have. It's actually a sin to be covetous because it breaks one of the 10 commandments, thou shalt not covet. So it's actually a sin to want what other people have or to be envious. A grindstone is a round sharpening stone used for grinding or sharpening ferrous tools. So it's something you'd sharpen your tools on, and it's a typical sort of simile to say, you know, that you're kind of put to the grindstone, and it might suggest that he works people very, very hard. Gait is your way of walking. So he has a very stiff, kind of uncomfortable gait, as if he's so frozen he can't walk very freely. Shrewdly shows good judgment. So characters, people around him shrewdly know that they would judge that he's not a man to go towards just by the way he looks and the way he approaches people. And to bestow or give a trifle means to give something small. And so beggars know that he's not somebody to ask even for the smallest thing. Evil eye, as I've said before, is a reference to the devil. So it suggests that he's already a very sinful and evil character. So what do we learn about Scrooge's character from this description? In your task, you're asked to create a mind map of ideas around the image. And you can do that by creating yourself little text boxes and create your own. That's how I did it. I just created some text boxes and put my ideas into those. And that allowed me to add to this page. So some of the things I sort of thought were important: cold-hearted, mean, obviously, greedy, clutching. He likes to be alone. He's very solitary, and people leave him alone because he doesn't seem to be somebody to actually approach. He's avoided. He's never generous or giving, and people kind of instinctively know that. And he has no warmth about him at all, even at Christmas. In fact, he's exaggeratedly cold, isn't he? So some of the quotations that you've been asked to look at in more detail, because they show some of the strong side of his character and most noteworthy to talk about. Hard and sharp as flint, from which no steel had ever struck out generous fire. Well, I think the hard and sharp is quite simple, because they both suggest and have connotations of someone that's somebody you wouldn't want to approach, that's a very hard personality, really, edgy and uncomfortable. But sharp as flint. Now, flint is a stone that we normally use to create fire. So if you use a flint, you can rub flint together and it will create a spark. And actually, it's very sharp. It's a grey kind of stone, and it is usually very sharp. But the fact that his sort of form of flint never creates a generous fire is sort of a bit of a juxtaposition, and it suggests that he doesn't really do what actually he should do, which is to create some warmth. I like this particularly because I love the list, as it creates a really sort of strong sense of his meanness, and you can always physically see his meanness in the verbs that are being used as adjectives here. So, but he was a tight-fisted hand at the grindstone, Scrooge, a squeezing, wrenching, grasping, scraping, clutching, covetous old sinner. Well, all of those sort of build and build and build and build, don't they? This sense of a character who just takes and takes and takes, and will take from people and scrape out the last little bit that they can get. And as a moneylender, that would probably be something he would do. He would scrape out every little bit of interest he can get from his business. Covetous old sinner, well, we talked about the word covetous. He envies what other people have, really. And Dickens ends very strongly on the sense that he's a sinner. And this tale is very much about trying to sort of perhaps make him reform in his behaviour. Being a sinner is obviously going to take you to only one place, and that place is hell. The cold within him froze his old features, knit pointed nose, shriveled his cheeks, stiffened his gait, made his eyes red, his thin lips blue, and spoke out shrewdly in his grating voice. A frosty rime was on his head and on his eyebrows and his wiry chin. Now, if I was to annotate that, I'd be looking really at the very physical description of it, which is humorous in many ways, because it kind of has that frosty rime physically showing us how cold he is. And it's obviously very hyperbolic, it's very, very exaggerated. But you also have a semantic field or an extended metaphor of the cold there, which seems to be the most important thing that Dickens will take away from this. And then finally, the simile, secret and self-contained and solitary as an oyster. And the oyster, I think, is an image worth exploring a little bit more, simply because oysters do have the precious pearl within them. Maybe they do have something of great value and a very precious sort of thing to find at the very heart of them, but they do have a very, very tight shell. And so perhaps, whilst it kind of quite easily suggests the idea of being solitary and alone, it also suggests that there might be a pearl of some sort within this character that we can find later on. So some of the methods, I've just put some here for you to help you along your way with your nation, and just so we focus on the fact that Dickens is a really clever craftsman when it comes to characterization. So one of his top tricks is hyperbole or exaggeration. He doesn't mind going as far as he needs to go to really drum home what he wants you to see in a character. We had that long list of adjectives which intensify the extent of his meanness. We've talked about those. If you notice, all those adjectives would usually be considered progressive verbs: clutching, grasping, scraping, squeezing. They're all actions, and they're all actions in the moment. They're all continuing actions. And it suggests that he's actively mean, and he's actively grasping. So he's actively taking from others in a very greedy way. So I think it's quite clever the way he uses these sort of progressive verbs, but as adjectives, to describe his character. The sounds themselves throughout the story in that opening are really sharp. We might call that sort of sharp assonance. They sort of add to the feeling: scraping, squeezing, wrenching. They sound harsh, and it kind of goes with the idea that he's sharp and hard throughout. There's obviously the extended metaphor of coldness, which we've seen there before. The similes emphasize how isolated he is. We've talked about that. And you've got that sort of, you could talk about extended metaphor, or you could talk about a semantic field of cold throughout, exaggerating this complete lack of warmth in his character. He's contrasted to even the worst weather, which is actually more generous than him. He's directly described as a sinner, which is really important to the rest of the story. And the adjective covetous is a direct reference to the 10 Commandments in the Bible: thou shalt not covet. To envy others and want what belongs to them is a sin. So to be a covetous sinner is, he's directly breaking one of the commandments, which might actually make his progression to heaven very, very questionable in a Christian society. And I noticed there that there's some industrial imagery, really, the grindstone and flint. Remember, Victorian England at the time was a time of great industrialisation, and it was a time where rich people were getting richer from the industry that was being undertaken, and the poor people were becoming much poorer as a result, because they were being used within the workplaces but were being paid so little. So it seems to me that the industrial imagery is sort of being fed in there somewhere to kind of create a sense of the context. So why do you think Dickens exaggerates how cold and cruel Scrooge is towards others? Who do you think Scrooge represents in Victorian society? I'm sure you've got lots of ideas about this, and he is a really interesting character to explore. Some of the things I thought, he's really characterised as extremely mean and uncaring. So he tends to represent the very worst qualities of humanity in many ways, some of the things that as a society we really wouldn't want to encounter too often. He's exaggerated as having an extremely cold heart, and this creates a sense of a very greedy and uncaring nature. Again, think about the industrial context. Think about the idea of people who are suffering within Victorian England and who may need the generosity of the richer people to help them. Scrooge is the absolute antithesis or opposite of that, isn't he? He's somebody that won't help and won't care because he has such a cold, frozen heart. He represents really that greedy, rich capitalist or moneymaker. He's grasping and clutching for more money all the time, and that's how he makes his living. That's why his business is so important to him, and that's why he affects everyone so harshly around him. He's sinful. His greed goes beyond just a desire to better himself, a desire to be good at business. His greed is actually to the point of sinfulness because it's selfish. He doesn't care for anyone else but himself. He remains isolated and self-contained rather than ever stepping out to help others. And people in need actively avoid him in that description, don't they? Because they know that he won't help. And I think it kind of comes together with the idea that Dickens is really aware of the extreme divide between the rich and poor, and he wants you to see this as a character who is going to be affecting this. Scrooge clearly needs to change, and that's an important part of the opening of his characterization. He's established very swiftly as a character who's sinful, who's in danger of really going to the depths of hell for his nastiness. And for his own sake and for the sake of society, he's a character that needs to be better. So how Scrooge changes as a character is perhaps going to be the main point of this moral tale. I hope that little webinar helped you with reading those extracts if you were finding them a little bit difficult. I know it is difficult to get to grips with some of the Victorian language, which is why it might help you if you do keep listening to the audio recordings. There are so many good film versions of this, and Scrooge is characterised so often that it's really worth just seeing him in action, and I think you'll very quickly get to grips with his character. Thank you very much for listening, Year 10, and bye-bye.